Hello, everybody. We are honored today to have with us Mr. Seymour Hersh. Now, this is a man of dignity and class and style and grace and information that's very important to know about and read about. He just came out with this article, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. And if you click down below, you can read the whole article. Now, this is a Seymour Hersh who gained recognition when he came out and exposed the terrible My Lai massacre that happened in Vietnam. He's also the author of a number of great books, and he also is the guy, that one of his books is the Price of Power, Kissinger in the Nixon White House. And of course, he talks a lot about Nixon as well in a number of his books. He's the top of the top, a real man, that grew up without like these daddy's boys over here. He's a man that worked his way up and knows what it is. And what he said about journalism and the golden years are gone. It's so true. So here's Mr. Seymour Hersh to tell you about the Nord Stream pipeline, who did it, why, where and when, and much, much more. I'd like you to comment on this. This is quoting you. You said that you describe yourself as a reporter, quote, as a survivor of a golden age in journalism. You said it was a time when, quote, we did not have to compete with 24-hour news channels. Newspapers were awash with advertising revenue, and I was free to travel as much as I wanted. You went on to say you could reveal, quote, important and inconvenient truths. So that's a quote by you. Those days are gone, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. Now you got, I don't know. We're talking about, I joined the New York Times. Well, I did the My Lai stuff in 69, a year and a half after My Lai. And even then I had a hell of a time getting it published, but I got it published. And people picked it up and they weren't afraid to touch it. And, I'll tell you something about that story. Guys like you that served in Vietnam that ended up going into, let's say, the intelligence community. They were in the military and they went in, and let's say they were a generation. And some of these people, stay on a long time. If you retire and you become an annuitant, you're still in the job because you're very good at what you do and you care about it. I'm talking about deep inside. And so what it is, the guys that come to me or that I know are guys that saw firsthand what happened, didn't like it, went through it, and they're guys that took the oath of office when they became higher ranking people. You take an oath of office at higher levels. It's not to their boss or the colonel or the general, or it's not even to the president. It's to the Constitution. And those are the people I deal with that actually, and they look me out sometimes. For the last 30, 40 years, I find people that have called me up and said, we better start talking because things are crazy here. But things were okay. The news business, I wrote maybe 150, 200 stories for the New York Times without a source named, just said a source said. I wrote about the CIA going after Allende. I wrote about the CIA spying on American civilians. I wrote about the CIA and the NSA trying to get a Russian submarine up from the bottom without naming a source. And into the paper it went because they knew me and they trusted me. And it's not that people don't know me and don't trust me. It's just that they don't want to hear it anymore. And I think Trump, CNN, NBC, and Fox, I felt it's been a pollutant because you're either like Fox or you're like the other side. And so there's no middle ground. And they all hate each other. And CNN and MSNBC, if they can't get something about Trump on every day, now they're doing something about that kid from the congressman who lied about everything. He's a good story too. So they do that. There's no news anymore.
Yeah.
And then and when I was there busting stories in the 70s, like on Vietnam and Watergate in the afternoon, I'd go all day in a story. And I'm writing for a daily newspaper. And sometimes I had a good story going, and the public relations people, there was just a couple of people in the New York Times would call up and say, oh, NBC or CBS wants to do it. And I said, what are you talking about? Go on, read it in the paper. They don't have to go on television about something. The idea of doing it. And now the idea of doing a story and not going on CNN or MSNBC, the yap about it, and now they're all getting paid probably more money from the cable companies than they do. And so you have a situation where cable comes in, they have no discernment. Something happens, they run, it's called a cron, they run a little thing, breaking news. Nobody checks anything, nobody looks at it, nobody spends a week on a story or a month on a story. And so when I come up with something like this, I've obviously spent 3, maybe more than that on it. I've done a lot of time on that story. And if you read it, you can see it because I've got all this detail about meetings.
I read it.
Well, yeah, of course. It's a fish out of water.
Yeah.
And I've done more stories about it. We use the Norwegians, and I did another story for Substack about how we use the Norwegians undercover in North Vietnam. Norwegians and us have been together in COVID ops. It's not just new we went to Norway. Norwegians, they hate Russia. What worries me now is hating Russia and hating Putin and not liking China as is boxing us in. How are you going to get out of this mess? Yeah, I'll tell you something. I do talk to people that see stuff, and I don't talk about I don't care about day-to-day intelligence, but the chances of the Ukrainian army beating the Russians, whether you like Russia or don't like Russia, the Russians in the Stalingrad, everybody knows about Stalingrad. They lost 20 million people in World War II. That's a lot of soldiers. They were losing in the last 3 or 4 days of Stalingrad. They were losing every 48 hours, 4 days. Every 4 hours, every day, 2,400 killed and wounded in the last couple of days, and they kept on going, and they beat the Nazis back. And so you can understand. Maybe you don't have to understand it, but they're very tough, and the regular army hasn't gone in yet. And unlike us, when we want more guns, when the president wants more, wants that, we put $113 billion in there already.
I know.
And I will tell you, by fall, when he decided to blow up the stuff in the pipeline, I assuming you'll introduce me and tell something about the story. By that time, they was pretty sure that at best it was going to be a standoff, and a very expensive, killing a lot of people, a lot of money. And he was the whole point of blowing up the pipelines. I don't know why it's so hard for people to understand that. The whole point is the Germans, after World War II, they spent 10, 15 years trying to rape, murder, and mutilate and bomb everything in Europe. They leaned over backwards to get back in good graces. The Germans are not interested in rearming. That will make the French will go crazy. There was a lot of worry about the Germans being even in NATO back then, 50 years ago. And so the Germans don't, they'll put some money in, but they don't want to go in all the way in Ukraine. Particularly, it doesn't look like a winner. And NATO, a lot of the countries in NATO are saying we're going to fork out more money to these guys. So the White House was worried about it in the fall. They learned it was going to be a tougher war than they thought. I'm sure they knew it before that, but that's the best guess I can get for what he did. And so Biden gave the go to blowing. We planted the bomb, C4. We planted them earlier in May or June. The CIA and other groups did, working with the Norwegians. We did what the president wanted. That's what they do for a living. And by fall, they thought, well, what's the reason of doing it anymore? They were initially assigned before Christmas of 2021, when Russia was building up remember they were building up in Belarus. I'm assuming your audience is I've been told it's a good audience. They read and think. So the Russians spent a long time showing their cards. And in December, the White House organized a meeting, a very top secret meeting. That's in my story. A guy named Jake Sullivan.
Yep.
Who's no more than 2 or 3 times over his head, but at least 2, maybe 3. So Sullivan, he worked for Hillary. He was her lawyer, and he worked for a guy named Stowe Talbot, who's a friend of mine, but whose mission in life was to build up NATO and stick it to the Russians. Nothing. Look, don't misunderstand me. Putin did what he did was wacko, starting a war, the most bloody war since World War II. You cannot respect him for that. but you can't say he didn't have some provocation. He made a deal in 1990 to let Germany, the history is just, it's not unimportant. West Germany and East Germany merged. You know, we had a Cold War going. East Germany was in the Warsaw Pact, for God's sakes. And it was all over for the Russians in 89 and 90. Everything collapsed. Their economy collapsed. And so East Germany joined West Germany, and the new Germany wanted to go into NATO. Gorbachev was then the boss of the Russians. And he said, you could do it, but make a promise that you won't expand NATO to the east, up to our borders. And Russia always considered Ukraine to be a subcultural. It was just a big landmass that protected him from Western Europe that didn't like him. And but just to give you an example, in 1932, there was a great famine. 22 million people in the Ukraine starved to death because Stalin took all the grain and moved it up to regular Russia. I mean, the treatment of the Ukrainians by the Russians has been horrible, and there's that factor too. But in any case, suddenly we're in a war with Russia. NATO's in a war with a no end, and if NATO and America want more bombs, we have to go to contractors. We have to go to one of the big defense industries. We have to make a contract. It has to be lawyered, has to be a kill fee, has to be all this regulations, have to have investigators and people inspecting the process. When Putin wants to do arms, he controls the industry. He says, you guys stop making what you're making and make me more bombs. He's got, he's got total control of the industry. We did that in World War II. Remember the woman, all the women who went to work and they were turning out one ship a week. Remember that? Yeah. And airplane after airplane.
Rosie the Riveter.
Rosie the Riveter. You remember that?
I remember the song. It was for my time. We're going to take a break now. We've got a lot more going on. And this is why you subscribe to the Trends Journal.
Get the Trends Journal, the best investment you could make, because it's the best investment into your mind and it can change how you look at the world.
Over the last 30 years, Gerald Celente has been more accurate about predicting what would be happening than anyone else I'm aware of.
The Trends Journal is one of the greatest sources of information, and and it really is. You're predicting these things well ahead of time. I would encourage everyone to go grab the latest copy.
Been a Trends Journal subscriber for 20 years. I just have to commend you. What you guys have put together in your latest Trends Journal, there's nothing like this out there.
Sir, everything that you predicted about the economy, you were absolutely right. So I have followed you all this time. So please take a look at the Trends Journal.
You correctly forecast that the Fed would hike rates quite aggressively, correctly said that initially gold and silver would drop as the Fed starts to raise rate to 1.5% and above. When we spoke last, Bitcoin was around 49,000. You said you expect to drop, and if it drops below 30, 35, then it could really drop.
Trends Journal, which I would encourage people to go and check out. It's actually a 200-page document, pure data-driven analysis.
Gerald Celente, the top trends forecaster in the world. Gerald, you had an interesting call back in September of last year. You said gold had bottomed, which is exactly what happened. And here we are, and we're above $1,900.
Subscribe to the Trends Journal. Read history before it happened at trendsjournal.com.
I had my wife's uncle flew B-17s, 38 missions. He enlisted. After 25, you could go home. The death rate was flying over Germany in daytime bombing. We didn't have. They had air cover up to the border of Germany, and then I'm not kidding. No air cover. And then they got they were Navy planes, and they didn't have enough fuel to go into Germany. So when you flew the B-17s from north of London, you had a 10% loss rate.
Wow.
I got to tell you, the guys who did World War II just didn't talk about it. Ben Bradley, who was the editor of the Washington Post for years, was a friend of mine. Even though I was at the New York Times, played a lot of tennis with him. Good guy. Had 4 years there. Just didn't talk about it as an officer in the South Pacific. There was nothing to be said. The kamikaze were coming every day. Must have been an absolute nightmare. But these guys, they lost 10%, and every week, 4 or 5 more B-17s with young kids that barely knew how to fly would come in from America, be ferried in. And it just every week, more and more planes. The one night my uncle got drunk with my wife's uncle. He was my uncle too. I knew him many years. Norman was his name. One night he got drunk with me really badly, and he told me what he never talked about. After a little while, you didn't even make friends over breakfast because you're going to go out and fly that day, and you didn't know who would come back. So he didn't make friends. He chased the girls in the community. He's a very handsome guy, so he was all right with that. But you didn't make friends, and when you had, and the rotation for the 8th Air Force rotated, and in other words, the 8th Air Force, 500 planes would be going on daytime attacks, and everyone twice in those 43 missions, he was the lead guy, which meant that he's the guy. He's over the target. He's got to be over the target. He's got to stay. And every Messerschmitt and every ACAC is on the lead plane, so they know they're going to get hit. And they go in, and the door gunners load up so much guns, so many ribbons of guns, big heavy guns. That plane can almost not get off. And as soon as the cover left him, I don't know, not France, they were flying north of it. But anyway, as soon as they lost the cover and they crossed the border from Belgium into Germany, they lost their cover. There's the Messerschmitts. And so the door gunners, when the first wave came, would start, it's about 15 minutes to target. They had enough, they would shoot for 15 minutes straight. And if another the B-17 happened to somehow end up in their line of sight, it was shot down. They would just shoot. And you get over target, and you'd be riddled. You'd come home with at least one engine out and holes in the plane. The rescue crews, it was just amazing to do it. And anybody that knew anything about war, like the military guys do, the generals may like it, but I got to tell you, the guys who fight it, they're not interested in another war. Certainly not with Russia. But I don't know where we're going with this stuff.
Well, going back to what you said, we publish a magazine, the Trends Journal. This is from 2014, when the United States launched a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. And the article was written by Paul Craig Roberts, former assistant Treasury Secretary under Reagan. Washington is driving the world to the final war. He goes on to say, Washington concluded that Russia needed to be confronted with or distracted by problems that would leave the Russian government less confident or able to counter Washington's aggression elsewhere. Ukraine presented the perfect opportunity for Washington to advance its hegemonic agenda. In a speech at the National Press Club last December, which was December 2013, and I remember watching it, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland boasted that Washington had invested $5 billion in non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in Ukraine for the purpose to, quote, teach democracy.
And
so
also,
it was the United States coup that people have no idea about.
And you mentioned the Maiden coup in 2014. Absolutely.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, the deal with Gorbachev and was with
Jim Baker did it.
Yeah. NATO would not move, quote, 1 inch further. No. And there was 16. Now there were 30. And in reading your article, and I read the whole article and underlined what I thought are salient points, the bottom line, the reason why they're saying that it's not credible is because it's an anonymous source. And in the beginning, you said that they all use anonymous sources, but when they use an anonymous source, it's legit.
No,
but when you put out this information in detail, it's discouraged. It's not accurate.
I'll tell you what I consider when I worked for I really had sources. Now I think the anonymous sources are a press secretary for the president or one of the cabinet members who whispers to them, and after a briefing, we'll give you a better feel. When I got to New York Times, I went to New York Times in '72. I actually, because the Times then was a straight paper. It was good on the war from Vietnam. David Halberstam, those names, Neil Sheehan, a guy named Homer Biggert, wonderful reporting. But in Washington, the Times was always president focused a little bit, much more. And so I did the My Lai stuff, and I couldn't get hired by a newspaper because I'd been an AP. I've been an AP Associated Press correspondent. I covered the war from the Pentagon for a couple of years, which is I learned how to hate the Vietnam War from officers who told me what was going on and GIs. In any case, so I I couldn't get a job even after doing. I went, and let me tell you something about my country. This isn't about not liking America.
Oh.
My parents were immigrants. They came to this country not knowing English. My father had by the time I was 6 or 7, my father was running a small laundry and cleaning store in the ghetto, in the black ghetto in Chicago. And from the age of 13 on, I worked there. He got cancer at 15 and died a very bad death 2 years later. But I took over running the store, and I learned a couple of things from that. I was always like sports, and on Sundays, when in Chicago in the 50s, early 50s, when this happened, I was born in 37, so this would have been 52, 53. On Sundays, every other Sunday, the White Sox left Comiskey Park and played their games in other stadiums. And every other Sunday, the Negro League played. This is right after World War II. And when I was working for my dad, and there were a couple of guys who worked for my dad, pressing pants for 12 cents a pair. And they take me to ball games on Sunday because, I always played ball. The best ball I played was in the Army, actually. But anyway, so I got to know that because my skin was different, I was going to have a better life than they did. I mean, they knew it too. I learned that when I was 14, 15. So I was always sensitive. And you have to understand, when you have a war against a minority, like we did in Vietnam, and not in the Ukraine, not against Russia, but when we had wars like we did, in the famous war in Grenada, it's racial. It turns out to be racial for the kids doing it, because that's the only way they can cope. It's just anyway. And so I grew up and I worked part-time, and when I graduate, I got a ride to school. University of Chicago. I was a smart kid, and we sold everything. My mother finally moved to California. I have a brother too who took care of her. I had her for 4 years, and then my brother had her. Had to take care of my mom. I had older sisters who were married and split as soon as they could, and so I came up not from the Harvard Crimson or the Yale Daily News. I come up from a kid from nowhere. If you remember John R. Tunis, his wonderful books, The Kid from Tompkinsville, about a kid who played center field as a 19-year-old rookie for the Dodgers. Anyway, I came up, and here in 69, I'm sticking 2 fingers in the eye of a president, Nixon, newly elected, right in his eye. And am I in the gulag for it? No, I'm fame, fortune, and glory. I won every prize, Pulitzer Prize, all this stuff. And so I'm not knocking America. I'm just knocking these guys' version of America, because that's not the right America.
Oh,
and,
look, I agree.
Why hasn't anybody in your office sent me that article? When you're done, have somebody send me an email, and I'll give you my just make a PDF of those pages. I want to read that stuff.
Yeah,
I knew who he was, the guy who wrote it.
Look at just to show you some of the articles we've been writing in the magazine. This is the cover. We sent it to you. That's after your article came out. Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? We will bring an end to it. I promise you. We quoted Biden back in September. These are just some of the articles, one after another. We've been writing.
It's so interesting you say that, because nobody's asked that question yet of the president at a news conference. And 4 days, it blew up on the 26th. And I think look, I'm not in Joe's mind. And
well, if you're not in Joe's mind, you'd be out of your mind if you were in Joe's mind.
I just mean by that, I don't know.
I know.
I know what his deputies do. I know what Blinken and Newland and Sullivan know. They applauded the overthrow of the government and the Maiden overthrow in 2014. They orchestrated it. We know all that.
Yep.
And we know they're dead set. And we had a Secretary of State, Blinken, go to China after delaying because of a balloon. He delayed visiting China because of a balloon. An F-22 shut it down.
Yeah, I know. We wrote about it. Yep. It's like $400 million or something to do.
And you know what the pilot did?
There you go. There's the cover.
Oh, yeah.
Up goes the weasel.
You guys are wild, man.
Yeah.
So who reads you? What's your circulation?
Oh no, we have it's an international magazine. You know, one day at one time I used to be on Oprah, the Today Show, Good Morning America. I used to be on everybody, and I have best-selling books, Trends 2000, Trend Tracking, and I got
I did know that. I didn't know that.
yeah they blacklisted me when I said what would happen with the Afghan war, and you said you're from the South, South Chicago. By the way, I lived in Chicago for 7 years back in the
Where?
70s.
Depends on where, buddy.
Well, I was up in Evanston, but I worked in the city.
Come on.
All right. I'm just saying. But hey, but I'm a Napolitano that grew up in the Bronx.
I grew up on 47th Street in the South Side.
Yeah, it's a whole different trip.
Public school. We played against the Catholic school 2 blocks away. We played on every sport against them, and it was always bloody. You know, I'm talking about we played touch football, tackle football with no equipment. And we played basketball with elbows in the mouth every time you went up. And it was really, Chicago's very gritty. It's a great, and by the way, Chicago's become, I hate to say it, Daley started it. I mean, it's become an amazing city. And it's got all these racial problems, but at least they look at them. And it's got that lakefront that they did a spectacular job on. But, but they're losing it on the shooting stuff, aren't they?
Yeah. But anyway, so when you talk about how you grew up, I grew up in the Bronx. You know, we social climbed to Yonkers later on.
Oh, that's a big jump, man.
But so I understand what you say because we didn't, our daddies, like these other guys, we're not born on third base, and so we have a different passion of life because we're fighters and we had to fight our way up to get where we are. As I say, it's Harvard, Princeton, Yale, bullets, bombs, and banks. As George Carlin said, it's one big club and you ain't in it. And that's the club in control. So when you say this isn't about not liking America, it's about our loss of the America that we used to love so much.
Well, it's there. It's still there. But it's funny you mentioned George Carlin because he should be required viewing. Although he offends a lot of people, he does a thing on the church that doesn't help anything. But anyway, he was a genius. Look, I was in for $2 to cover a $1 cover. You could go listen to the best jazz in the world. Miles Davis and there's a place called on 46th Street. You could go hear I'm serious. You could hear everybody, Candido, and you could also go listen to Lenny Bruce, talk about, how God is merchandising, what's for sale this week. And, for all the priests to push, it was just awful, but funny. And he, of course, was coked up anyway. And you also could get anything you wanted back then. We called it Mary Jane.
Yeah.
Well, I covered police in Chicago as a kid for the City News Bureau, which is the old crime business. And you learn the cops. There was 2 things they would do, but I worked night shifts and, they would come in and it'd be pretty nice if they had a little extra stuff. They caught some dope, but they throw a bag at us. And they used to always give us the 8mm porn movies. We could watch those on the camera. This is back in the 60s, 61. And so when you do that, the only thing you couldn't do in Chicago is you couldn't report on crooked cops, of which there were plenty. And you couldn't report about the cops and their deals with the Giancana mob on West Street, the big play street. So I learned early on, it was a tyranny, really. I mean, I learned about censorship right away as a kid reporter. You couldn't do it. If the cop station up in the near north side of Chicago, where all the bars were and the play places were, if they reported some guy that had 11 bullet holes in him as a traffic accident, forget about it. You can't go and say, what do you mean traffic accident? That was a mob hit. I grew up in that world too. I mean, I knew about the mob. Yeah. And it ended up, one of the things I did for the New York Times after the war was over, I did 6 months with a wonderful reporter named Jeff Girth on a guy named Sidney Korshak that ran the mob in Chicago. And that was about as much fun as putting your head in a foxhole or climbing into it. I got more death threats, but this stuff doesn't compare to what growing up in Chicago trained you to not worry about what the New York Times and Washington Post thinks about my stories. And that's what makes Substack so interesting. I didn't know about it. A terrific journalist, old-time friend of mine, Matt Taibbi, who's doing
Oh
good.
yeah, I followed him.
He said, you can publish here. You'll be fine. A lot of people read it. And so it's an alternative form. But getting back to the real story, what is the end game? And why did he do the pipeline? He did it in September 26th. And the guys, you should know, the guys who were assigned to do it, they were assigned in this first started 2 months before the war began in 2021. Jake Sullivan, as President's National Security Advisor, convene a meeting of in a very secure place in the executive office building, which is in the same compound. It's just across the street from the White House, but it's still covered by walls and fences and guards. And they have a very secure reading room. He convened a meeting with guys in the NSA, CIA, the Pentagon, the National, actually the Joint Chiefs, the Treasury and State Department, not that many. And they were asked a question, we need options. We need something we want to stop the Russians. What can we do to make the Russians not go? Because, that would be hell. Go into Ukraine. Despite all the talk, there was a lot of worry about that. And, you don't mess around with the Russian army.
Nope.
And I used the phrase I used was actually the work of art in the meeting. The question they asked the White House, do you want reversible or irreversible options? We're talking about before Christmas, before New Year's. And the word came back, well, irreversible would be sanctions. Ask the Cubans about sanctions. They've been sanctions since 61.
Yeah.
And the saying, look how the sanctions didn't work on Russia we put on, that the Biden administration put on. Russia's still going. There's still American companies there. Not everyone left. And so they don't have McDonald's. There's something not as good, but they still line up for it. And the irreversible turned out to be, let's go after the pipeline. And you have to understand, as I didn't realize how important this is. I'm going to write more. I've been writing more on Substack. I'm writing every week on this because it's fun. And by the way, I use the same editors I used at the New Yorker and the London Review and the same fact checkers. It's out of my pocket instead, but there's no, I'm my own producer.
Oh, great.
And what happens is there's a long history of America after containment, after World War II, we had to contain communism, even as long as the Kennedy administration about worrying about Russian natural gas and oil. Russia had the lock on that stuff all over. When you start going towards Siberia, there's nothing but stuff underground. And the worry was they were going to use their gas and sell it to Germany, which was trying to become an industrial complex after the war, after the destruction of the war, and be a good neighbor. That's the other. It was called Ostpolitik. Willy Brandt started this idea of telling the people he had raped and murdered and destroyed, I'm going to be a good buddy to you. I'm the French. I know you hate me, but I'm going to be an industrial powerhouse. I'm going to trade with you at good terms. I'm going to make you guys realize we're really a solid country. And they are. The Germans are incredibly competent. And they were getting gas and oil from Russia early. And we always worried about it. That's Germany's part of it. We always thought that eventually West Europe would accept Germany at some point. NATO's a force. And these countries, the oil and gas was particularly the gas was so cheap. Russia had more than they could use, and they were downstreaming it to the companies, the distributors all over Europe. So here's a fortress America. We built up Western Europe after the war, but they have no oil and gas in Western Europe. And the idea that Russian had an inroad was always a problem. It's not a new idea. It's been going on forever and ever. I'm writing about that next week. It's always been an idea. It's always been in the theme. It's always been a theme in the Congress and so here Biden finally bit the bullet. Here they built Nord Stream 1, these pipelines. The first one came on in 2011, and it was a gold mine for the Germans, just a gold mine. The largest chemical company in the world, BASF, 100,000 employees, was just making a fortune. They own and by the way, it's now it had its first layoff ever. And it's also talking to the Chinese about maybe moving some facilities there. They're not hurt that bad, Germany, because they're subsidizing gas, the oil price, and the price of electricity. The French are paying 500 times more, 5 times more.
The numbers just came out for energy increase in Germany this last month. It went up 19.1%.
Of increase of available or the price?
Energy prices went up 19.1%.
Oh, I didn't see that. I know before that they kept the
kilowatt. Came out today.
Well, it's because it's colder now. They had a very mild winter. Remember we saw the pictures of no ski. They had a mild winter, and also they under pressure from us. The Germans had shut down the new pipeline. It was Nord Stream 2 was brand new. When it was done by 2020, and they filled it with gas, 750 miles full of gas. That's what went up when they bombed it. But Schultz, the chancellor, had the power. He had shut it down. He had the power to open it. And so I think Biden's thought, I don't know. I'm just giving you a good guess. It's not only my guess. The community has had this assessment too, that he saw a stalemate coming. He saw winter coming. He thought inevitably if it was a bad winter, and if the stalemate, Germany wasn't interested in putting a lot of money in for war. They learned a lesson in World War II. Their militarization has always been a sore spot there. There's a lot of opposition to it. A lot of people want them to build up the army, but there's opposition. Anywhere, depending on your count. The police said last weekend there was a demonstration against the Ukraine war, and the police said 15,000 or 13,000. The newspaper people who were there, some of them, and the organizers said 50,000. It was a huge crowd anyway against the war. And remember, like we had that started here against the war in Vietnam. There's a lot of analogies to it. And just to go on with the story, so I think what Biden did by telling Schultz, taking the option of opening up the gas line and maybe taking gas from Russia and maybe not giving as much support to Ukraine, particularly as it looked like it was going to go south, which it will be. Don't worry about what you read in the newspapers, because they have the New York, their coverage has just been, some of it is very good. The New York Times has a lot of great reporters, but the coverage on Iraq has been comical. It's not, I can't tell how many people have signed up for Substack with me and send me letters. You can do it on my emails there and said, thank God we finally got somebody who might tell us the truth. They smell it. It's not good. It's too pro the White House and Congress, which has always been always anti-communist and Congress. I don't expect in the Vietnam War the Democrats in Congress were against the war, and the War Powers Act was written and supported by 5 or 6, 7, 8 moderate liberal Republicans. In fact, they wrote the document. They wrote the first treaty. A guy named Bill Miller that worked for the senator from Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper. They drafted it. I mean, Republicans then, the moderate Republicans, were against the war. Now they're blank. Chuck Schumer's going to ask for an investigation into the pipeline bombing because of the implications for Europe. The implications are we've always had Europe's back. We no longer, the Europeans, the Germans and the Europeans, and certainly NATO know, some countries know, that we don't have their back anymore, that he chose the war over them. Cutting the act of, it's really, if I were, look, I had a lot of contact with people in the Bundestag, their parliament. I don't do politics. I never testified. I didn't talk to anybody from that. But I will tell you, there's a lot more concern about Biden cutting off their ability to have cheap, run their industries and stay warm. You took that option away from them. And the consequences of that, will be seen, particularly next year if it's a cold winter, because they don't have the storage anymore. They had a lot of stuff stored for this winter. All right, I'm done with my soliloquy.
Well, I just want to comment on some of the things you were talking about. On the rally in Munich, Schultz came out against it before it happened, and the media also, they called it a niche rally and made fun of it because, quote, there were right-wing people there. So it depends on, if you're anti-war, you just can't be anti-war. It's because you believe in something else. They don't like you. And number two, there are 84 million people in Germany. Some 50 million turned out. We had a rally in DC, War Against the Rage.
50,000.
50,000, excuse me. Rage Against the War Machine on February 19th, and I was one of the speakers there, and only about 2,000 to 4,000 people showed up. It was at the Lincoln Memorial, and it was brought to you by the Libertarian Party, the People's Party. And top people were there: Ron Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, myself, a whole crew. And I'm just saying, peace isn't a part of America anymore in the spirit of the country. And you're old enough to remember, too. The protests were going on in Vietnam because there was the draft.
And
there's no draft anymore. Nobody cares.
I'll tell you something else. I think that's a factor. But I've also learned in the last couple of years from Vietnam Veterans Against the War and other publications, there was much more dissent inside the Army in the war. I knew there was a lot, but there was a hell of a lot more than I thought. I mean, it even went to the aircraft carriers. There was a lot of problems that the Army had. But, that's their job, to fight a war, whether it's popular or unpopular. I don't know what to tell you, my pal. I don't know what to tell you. I worry about, look, again, getting back to the newspapers, after Trump, which was very scary for a lot of people, because there were some things about him were sort of interesting, I must confess. But basically, he did the wrong thing on the election. He did the wrong thing, and he absolutely did. There's no excuse for what he did. And there's no excuse for some of his policies because they were sort of irrational, very much. I was not a supporter of him in any way whatsoever. But having said that, the newspaper seemed to think, okay, Biden was not Trump, so that's why he won. But they've got to get tougher on Biden. They're just not tough enough on him.
You know what I call them? I call them media prostitutes, media whores that get paid to put out by their corporate pimps and their government whoremasters.
Well, but the media right now,
I'm just saying what the media is now. Oh, they just brought Psaki into MSNBC. Oh, where did she come from? Oh, where that guy Stephanopoulos come from? I mean, one after another.
I don't like the ex-CIA and FBI guys that are being paid to go up there.
Yeah.
But I will tell you a funny story. I got to go, and we could go on for 3 weeks, you and I, who would drink the most beer or whatever scotch I like. But we have a steak and a beer. Next time you come to town, I'll let you know.
I'm Italian. I drink wine.
I only buy good Italian wines, but that you can find great Italian wines it's amazing the stuff there. My wife's, one of her brothers is married to an Italian woman. And so we not because of COVID, we used to go up to Park Paradiso to hike in summer, up above and way up right below the Tunnel de France, the great park. There's beautiful national parks in Italy. You go up there and just fun. I hated it, but I hate hiking, but it sure is beautiful. Your country's beautiful. Your ex-country. Yeah. But I'll tell you a story about reporters that always knocks me out. So Biden flies. By the way, Biden flies to see Zelensky, and when he gets into Poland, the newspapers all write about it. The Air Force One, I assume it's Air Force One. They didn't say it. His plane, they turned off his transponder, his IFF, which has to be, that's the way other planes identify you. And one of the things that's ironic about it, there's some of these people who believe in open air in intelligence. The criticism for me, they monitor signals. No plane did what I said they did, drop a sonar to trigger the bombs at 3:00. I had whatever. No plane was there. And of course, all you have to do is turn off the transponder, as the president did, and you can't be seen by the OSINT guy. But it's an argument you don't even make with them. So committed to what they see, and they don't see pictures. They see electronic stuff. Turns off the thing, and then he lands, and then he takes a walk with Zelensky in Kiev. And oh my God, for the first time in 10 days, the air raid sirens go off. This brave guy, they haven't gone off since. And not one reporter has bothered to go and ask I did. And of course it was prearranged.
Yeah.
What do you think? I worked when the Vietnam War was on, and I wasn't fired by the AP, but I worked. I did 2 years covering the Pentagon, and I got into the guys that didn't like the war, and I began to write about all the bombing that was going on. This is before the days of satellites. So we didn't know what was going on. We just took the White House's word. And so the line, so McNamara was always over the head of the AP, you know, a perfectly nice guy named Gallagher. But eventually they pulled me out and they reassigned me to health and something like that. And I was a mess. I quit. Anyway. And so, and by the way, I left a good job at the New York Times. After 7 wonderful years, I started writing about corporations. Much easier to write about war and CIA ops than corporations. And then at the New Yorker, I was doing fine there until, I don't know, the politics of, I don't know, whatever the reasons are. They had nothing to do with reporting. I left that. And one of the things is, for somebody like me, is, I've said this once before to somebody, is nobody wants me really, because I walk into an editor's desk with a rat full of lice and I plop it down on this desk and I say, here's my next project. And it may cost you 50 or 100,000. I'm going to take off tomorrow and fly business class anywhere. And I'm going to go and maybe a 40%, 2 out of 5, I'll connect. And when I do connect, you're going to have extra fact checkers on it, because it's going to be a tough story to check. And then you're going to have the lawyers understand, your lawyers, that you're going to get 4 or 5 thefts from law firms. And then you're going to lose readers. So is it a wonder when I left it, I left after they shoved me into another job, that when I left, there was everybody go. And at the New York Times, when I started getting bitching about coverage of corporations, it was get out of here. And at the AP, at the New Yorker, I was very tough on a bunch of Obama stories. Obama was just a pal looking for re-election. I'm very down on Obama. I think
I called Obama out at the very beginning. Again, I call him the Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner.
Well, I was worried.
Look what he did to Libya. Look what he did to Syria. I want that guy Assad out of there. You grew up around the mob. I want that guy Gaddafi out of there. I mean, come on.
Well,
look at that.
For me, it was really simple. This 2 days into the presidency, he signed an executive order to close Guantanamo.
Yeah.
And at Guantanamo, the Bush-Cheney White House had somebody from the CIA after 2 months there, but there was so many worry about this madness that was going on, the torture of prisoners. R&R, they were mandated by the Red Cross International, 1 hour for prisoners, 1 hour a day. And so they would put people in a straitjacket and throw them out into a little square grassy area in 110 degrees for an hour. That was the R&R. I mean, I learned stuff very early about it. And so when he said I was going to close it and he didn't do it, was for me.
I began, without going into it, I began my career running political campaigns in Westchester County. I was the assistant to the secretary of the New York State Senate at 26 years old. I got on the inside, very quickly. And I've been with presidents, prime ministers, and princes in my lifetime. And to me, the people running in politics, these are the people I hated in high school and college and wanted to be class president. How could anybody with a pair of cojones bigger than a mothball look up to a Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, a little Chucky Schumer? Look at the little clowns telling us what to do. I mean, look at these little jerks that tell us what to do with their arrogant attitude. I just want to make one point about your article, by the way. One thing that wasn't mentioned is that, and maybe I missed it, energy, this is from Business Insider on August 13th, 2022. Energy traders are making a killing exporting U.S. natural gas to Europe as prices soar, with some single shipments bringing in $200 million.
Right.
That chart shows you the increase of America's exports going to Europe following the sanctions and then the bombing.
Well, that wasn't my story, but I do know something about it, because Germany's been building LNG they call it,
right,
facilities, but they're not coming as fast as they think. As a way of storing gas, and we were charging, I think, 3 and 4 times more. That's American, that's the American way. It's capitalism. But they also got what kept them going a little bit, made it a little easier for them. After the pipeline was blown up this fall and winter, China had a bad year because of COVID, and they had a lot of LNG, and they sold the LNG cheaper. But I watched I watched some of the journal you mentioned. I know that some of the people in there, they have probably the best reporting on energy that you want to get is in that, energy. It's an amazing group. There's a wonderful woman who used to be the editor there. They're very competent. But my story wasn't that. My story was about what to do. But I am going to do.
But could that have been another reason?
Watch this space. I know what you're talking about. And by the way, I want you to get a link to that article you sent. Okay. And I haven't blown I've got a terrible head cold.
All right.
I got to tell you something. Nobody has an old-fashioned cold anymore. It's either COVID or the flu. I just got a cold like I used to get when I was a kid. Yeah. And you remember them? You used to get a headache and then your nose ran. And it didn't stop you from talking, and it didn't stop you from going to the playground and all that stuff. And yellow snot all over. I remember that. The nice thing about growing up, the nice thing hold on. The nice thing about that's one of my kids. The nice thing about growing up in Chicago, all the seasons were there we have very little. We were lower middle class. As I said, my parents spoke pretty good English, but their basic communication was otherwise. They Russian, Ukrainian. They had a lot of languages, Polish, and but in the summer we had a backyard that was big enough to play football in, and then in winter, by Thanksgiving, we poured water into it and we skated. Wow. So I was playing hockey all winter, like a Canuck. And not good, but we skated. We went and we chopped each other up, and so it was a different world then. And we didn't have little leagues and all that stuff. I mean, I did all those things. I coached soccer for 15 years here.
Wow,
I do all that obligatory stuff parents did, but we did everything ourselves then. And not that this. My kids are great. They're perfectly out there. They're absolutely competent, but it was fun. You learn really to survive. Yeah. Chicago's a tough place. It was just fun, and so Kagan and not Kagan, but his wife and Blinken and this Jake. They don't muss my hair one bit. I don't care what they.
Arrogant.
This is not going to be good to them. He's not going to be good to Newland for what she did in 2014 because we overthrew a government.
Yep.
And that led to that's the core of this.
And also, you have her quotes. You have her quotes bragging about the blowing up of the pipeline.
Oh my God, the bottom of junk in the bottom of the sea.
Yeah.
Let me tell you. Anyway.
Thanks a lot, man.
Hey man.
By the way, Chicago, I used to say there were 2 seasons in Chicago: winter and August.
Do you remember? I'll tell you what. There was nothing worse. I was working for City News. I had about a 10-year-old Studebaker, and the Hawk we used to call it off the lake. I lived in Hyde Park. My father's family was on the south side. We lived near the Lake Michigan, and the wind when it was -4 by temperature was -15. I spent every winter for about 2 years working with that crappy car. I had to go out every 4 hours and start it because if I slept from 12 to 8, even if I was hungover like crazy, I had to start because the wind started, it would freeze. So I remember that's I got to tell you, when you're 21 or 22 and you're free at last. I'm not running the store. My mom's gone. I didn't know what freedom was. My favorite book I wrote about this once was the Adventures of Augie March. It was all about a kid in Chicago who wasn't making it like me. And it was hardcore. You probably had much more money in your family than I did. Come on.
There were 5 of us living in 2940 Hone Avenue in the Bronx, right off the Boston Post Road. And there were 5 of us with my brothers, 3 of us in one room, my 2 sisters in another room, and my parents in another room.
You did the same life. It's great.
Yeah.
It's great. Goodbye. I'm getting off. Gotta go.
Thanks a lot, man. It was really great. It's an honor, and thank you for all the
great stuff. I want to see that magazine because
I'll put you on the mailing list. Yeah. Again, I've been at this a lot of years, and I put my heart into it.
All right.
Yeah.
Good. I want to see it. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.